Welcome back to the world's most comprehensive explanation of the origin of COVID-19. Today's episode is about the wet market. It's the third of three. Check out the others for the story of the lab and the story of genetic engineering of the virus. Today is about the evidence of a market origin from the Huanan market in Wuhan. You might be familiar with the story of Dr. Li Wenliang, probably the most famous COVID whistleblower. Li Wenliang was an eye doctor at the Wuhan Central Hospital. On December 30th of 2019, he heard that a colleague who worked in the ER got a positive SARS result on one of her patients. He sent a WeChat message on that day to his medical school graduating class. He warned them, and he included a picture of the lab test result. He asked the recipients to keep the message in confidence, but he sent it to over 100 people, and it not only leaked, but it went viral. The English translation of the messages are, 7 confirmed cases of SARS were reported from the South China fruit and seafood market, isolated in emergency department of Haohu district of our hospital. And then he wrote, the latest news is it has been confirmed that they are coronavirus infections, but the exact virus strain is being subtyped. WeChat attempted to censor these messages, but they weren't quite successful. It appears that censorship algorithms can be overpowered temporarily by sheer volume, by crowdsourced sharing and resharing. This doctor was reprimanded harshly by local Wuhan police for spreading rumors, and he was forced to sign documents stating he was accused of, quote, publishing untrue statements about SARS cases at Huanan seafood market. Sadly, he contracted the virus and died on February 7th, though he was only 33 years old. He's shown here in the hospital holding his ID to the camera, which is a pretty harrowing gesture. I doubt we have the whole story of what happened to this man. After his death, people were enraged. There was a brief but strong protest and demand for free speech across Chinese social media platforms. People shared his WeChat message backwards in PDF form, with lots of emojis, in Morse code, anything to delay the algorithm from finding it and taking it down. And this protest was so robust that it was picked up by Western journalists. These 2 women were the first doctors we know of to recognize COVID patients in their respective ERs. Dr. Ai Fen worked at Wuhan Central Hospital with Dr. Li Wenliang. She is the person who treated a sick patient, took the sample, got that SARS result. Her attempts to raise the alarm were reprimanded and suppressed. But the doctors were passing this message around, and it found its way indirectly to Dr. Li Wenliang. Dr. Ai Fen saw a 65-year-old man on December 18th. He was a delivery man for the Huanan market, and he was admitted to the ER with a mysterious pneumonia. This is the first person hospitalized that we know of, but understand that does not mean he's the index case. That means there's probably between 50 and a couple hundred people infected at this time. Only the worst of them need hospitalization and are now trickling in to area hospitals. This delivery man was transferred to the ICU on December 22nd, and his doctor sent samples to a diagnostic sequencing company called Vision Medicals 2 days later on December 24th. They got the SARS result on December 27th. And between the 25th and the 30th, there were 6 other admissions of people to this hospital with similar illnesses. So of the total 7, 4 of them had a direct link to the Huanan seafood market. How do we know this? Are these stories true? And who says? Dr. Michael Warabi is a virologist at the University of Arizona, and he wrote a non-scientific paper called Dissecting the Earliest COVID-19 Cases in Wuhan. He gathered local Chinese news articles from the first few months of the pandemic and pieced together the series of events. Links to archived media and other documents are listed in the supplementary information for this paper, and it's freely accessible to the public. They're in Chinese, but Google Translate can help you read them, and you can assign the level of credence to the summary that you think is appropriate. Recall that Dr. Warabi signed the letter to Science magazine calling for an investigation into the origin of COVID-19. He has spoken previously about how he has a soft spot for conspiracy theories, and he also happened to be in poor health in the earliest days of the pandemic and was not in Fauci's inner circle of scientific experts to call upon. So he was untainted with the stink of the proximal origin paper and the infamous Zoom call and emails. But as I said before, the people who signed that letter go forward in wildly different directions, with some of them remaining the strongest critiquers of natural origin, whereas Michael Worraby becomes like the face of the strongest body of work in support of natural origin. Most of the timeline pieced together can be corroborated by Dr. Ai-Fen herself. She was not actually among those arrested, but she was treated poorly and she was clearly angry about it. And she did an interview with the Chinese version of People magazine. It was published March 10th of 2020, and she told her story. She gave details about what happened in her ER, and she expressed her frustration with the active silencing of her message and the censorship of the very existence of early cases. According to her, she was fiercely reprimanded by her hospital for trying to raise the alarm, and she was furious. Like, there's no other way to describe her tone. But Dr. Ai-Fen also had a second layer of frustration. She said patients continued to increase after the closure of the Huanan fish market on January 1st. She's saying it was very clear that not everyone with COVID was getting it directly from an animal. It was clearly passing between people, but the Chinese government stubbornly denied that until January 18th. The WHO humored Chinese authorities and tweeted on January 14th that there was no evidence of sustained human-to-human transmission, and even more strongly stated, it is clear we have no sustained human-to-human transmission, not just no evidence of it. Oof. Even though behind closed doors, in secret recordings, the same man is like clearly blowing a gasket. I think it's interesting he says general. I think that implies the WHO is talking to the military. I'm not sure how that works. But even Trump was involved in critiquing the extraordinary delay and admitting this very simple truth. And most news networks were in on covering the story of discovering that human-to-human transmission was happening. In retrospect, this seems strange. Of course, there is human-to-human transmission of the coronavirus, but sustained human-to-human transmission is language associated with zoonotic spillover. It is one feat for a virus to make a jump from animal to human, but it's a second feat entirely to be able to transmit between humans efficiently rather than die out after infecting just one or two. Remember, the first transmission, often bloodborne, but then the clock is ticking to figure out how to transmit through the air. So the earliest propaganda from the Chinese authorities was actually that all cases were linked to the market. All sick people were separate spillover events or very close contacts. If you don't work at the market, you're not at risk. Now that we close the market, this will go away. Denial of human-to-human transmission was very on brand for a government trying to placate the population and downplay this scenario internationally. And Dr. Ai-Fen was clearly frustrated with this as well. Her interview with People magazine was removed from the internet within 3 hours of its publication, but people did the same thing as with Dr. Li Wenliang's WeChat. The interview was translated to other languages, Braille, emoji, Morse code, Elven runes, anything to trick the algorithms. It was shared and reshared and picked up by other Asian news media. I put a YouTube video from World is One News on here, but there's many other examples. It was briefly reported that she had gone missing, but then she shared a photo of herself alive and well. But Dr. Ai-Fen had a cataract surgery shortly afterward in the spring of 2020. Something went wrong. She's now blind in one eye and is reported to have had a mental breakdown. Rewinding to late December, Dr. Zhang Zhijian was putting together the pieces independently in her ER at the Hubei Provincial Hospital of Integrated Chinese and Western Medicine. She saw a family cluster, 2 older adults and their son, in her emergency room on December 26th. She had treated SARS patients in 2003 and recognized the symptoms, so she ordered CT scans. She saw the characteristic ground glass opacities. She tried to raise the alarm to her supervisors. Her hospital seemed to be a healthier work environment. The department had become involved and notified local authorities the next day. After holding 2 internal emergency meetings following the identification of more cases, the director escalated to the Wuhan and Hubei province CDCs on December 29th. And almost certainly as a result of that escalation, a secret emergency notice was issued from Wuhan health authorities and distributed to local hospitals, notifying them to be on the lookout for SARS-like disease. This message leaked to the public 12 minutes later, And this is now December 30th. So it's the same day that Li Wenliang sent his WeChat message. So there are now multiple independent streams of activities and communication scrambling in late December. Of the 7 cases at the Hubei Provincial Hospital, 4 had a link to the market, with the 3 others being that related family cluster. That family was reported in early publications to have no link to the market, but later was reported that the older woman was in fact closely linked, so it is not clear their link to the market. After the briefly secret emergency alert was received, doctors at a 3rd hospital, the Zhongnan Hospital, identified 2 SARS-like cases in their ER, again, both of them with a link to the market. One person worked there but lived in another neighborhood and commuted. The other had friends who worked at the market who had visited him. This hospital went on to identify 3 more cases with no known link to the market in the coming days. And on January 1st, the Huanan market was shut down. The earliest cases were all transferred to the Jinyintian Hospital in northern Wuhan. On a map, here's the Huanan Seafood Market. Here's the Wuhan Central Hospital, where Dr. Ai Fen and Dr. Li Wenliang worked. And here's the Hubei Provincial Hospital, where Dr. Zhang Zijian worked. Here's the closest campus of the WIV. Doctors from the Jinyintian Hospital published the very first paper on the clinical features of COVID-19. This is the paper on 41 patients admitted prior to January 2nd. The preprint timestamp is January 24th of 2020. It highlights the major features of the new disease. Symptoms were fever, cough, fatigue, headache. Most cases were men. 30% had underlying disease. Median age 49. 15% of those hospitalized died. According to this paper, 27 of the 41 early patients, or 66%, had been exposed to the Huanan seafood market. Beyond that paper, there are actually 2 other estimates of the total percentage of the early cases with a direct link to the market. The second estimate comes from that Dissecting Early COVID-19 Cases by Michael Warby. Of the 19 cases that were mentioned in some kind of early news article, 53% were linked to the market. The last estimate comes from a report by the joint China-WHO investigation published in early 2021. As part of the investigation, the team analyzed local hospital records and retrospectively identified 168 cases with symptom onset in December, 33% of which were found to have an epidemiological link to the market. The joint China-WHO report on COVID origin is controversial and infamous. It was published in early 2021 after about a years-long investigation and authoring process. One of the sources of controversy is that Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance was on the investigation team, though he would have a clear interest in discrediting lab leak origin. But another reason is that the report concludes that lab leak origin scenario is extremely unlikely without providing conclusive evidence. For such a high-profile report, the argument needs to be really well supported, and these are just not pressure-tested claims that they're putting forward. Based on the no sustained human-to-human transmission comments, the WHO appeared to be playing along in the hope that they would get most information out of China by doing so. Thus, the report can perhaps be thought of as a compromise between reality and the Chinese government agenda. For example, a lot of effort is spent on justifying the possibility of the virus entering China through frozen food products, which were then sold at the market. And it is my understanding that this is the official origin story within China, and it's a story that at least appears to be believed on the ground, according to reporting by the podcast Fever. Though controversial, the contents of the report must of course be discussed. And just because it's flawed doesn't mean it's not useful. We're looking for suspicious omissions, unremarkable observations that make sense later, ways to reanalyze their data in a way they couldn't anticipate, stuff like that. There's 3 main topics: home addresses of the earliest cases, animal testing at the market, and environmental testing at the market. Environmental testing being swabbing, floors and carts and gloves and stuff. Several maps were included in the document. Here's 2, colored by how diagnosis was confirmed in one and known market exposure or not in the other. The images are blurry in the original document. It's not my copy pasting. By doing some creative overlaying of maps provided in the report, Warby and team extracted the address locations of almost all of the data points and made a friendlier image color-coded by whether or not there's a known link to the market. And they asked the statistical question, what is the center point of these dots? With the empirical null being the population distribution of Wuhan. And for this set of 155 case addresses, right in the 1% contour ring for most likely center of these dots is the Huanan market. The same epicenter is found when the data is restricted to only the unlinked cases, meaning the cases for which people report they don't have a known link to the market, those people still live in the area and are no further from the market than people who know their link to it. I'm not an epidemiologist. I can't confidently say this type of analysis is used all the time, or on the flip side, whether it's flawed. I find it intuitively compelling, but only if the underlying address data is true. Strangely, early case linkage data is used as an argument both for and against natural origin, because there's two ways it can be framed. Here's the first way. 33% of cases at a minimum have some obvious link to the market. Wuhan is a city of 11 million people. Everywhere else in the world, bars, restaurants, weddings, churches are the super spreader culprits, suggesting that an indoor-outdoor wet market, the most suspicious of all locations where SARS came from the first time, suggesting that was randomly the first super spreading event is asinine. So that's argument one. Argument two is that only 33% of early cases were linked to the market. Especially troubling is the early family cluster with no link. Maybe. I have a healthy belief in a person's ability to get a respiratory disease on public transit and a healthy skepticism of contact tracing. So I don't think this is the right way to think about it. 33%, 53%, 66%. Any number like that is stunningly high. This is incredibly compelling evidence, if it is true. Not that I'm saying there's a reason to doubt its veracity. I know people will balk at assumptions of integrity. Some types of data are borderline impossible to falsify, but addresses are not in that camp. Yet we've got these three tales. They agree with each other. The earliest one is from the front lines of chaotic times when there was no ducks in a row. It had been a mere 6 days since the government admitted that human-to-human transmission was taking place. It's 1 day after Wuhan locked down. It's 13 days since the first person died. To me, that seems like the least likely to be tampered with potential for decreasing integrity when there's more time to plot and plan. But the stories agree with each other, and they also agree with Dr. Li Wenliang's WeChat message, of which we are near certain said 7 cases from the Huanan seafood market. One of the biggest critiques of natural origin theory is the lack of positive animals at the market. In 2003, over 100 individual animals were found to have SARS by multiple scientific groups in multiple markets in the city, so why can't they find them this time? The Chinese CDC, headed by George Gao, was responsible for animal testing. All animal samples were reported negative by PCR. The animals tested were rabbit, stray cat, snake, hedgehog, moonjack, dog, badger, bamboo rat, mouse, pig, chicken, Chinese giant salamander, crocodile, wild boar, softshell turtle, weasel, fish, and sheep. These were supposedly the animals present at the market. Notably, the market was closed on January 1st. The report says the animals were sampled on January 18th, and testing extended into mid-February. This is confusing. Are they letting vendors in to care for the animals? The official story was no illegal wildlife was found at the market, and there are no verified reports of live mammals being sold. You may have heard interviews or podcasts with people on the investigation team saying we saw these signs listing the prices of live mammals that theoretically weren't being sold there. There were, in fact, lots of live mammals being sold at the market, of course. A Chinese veterinarian named Zhao Zhao happened to be performing monthly surveys of the market and 16 other markets in Wuhan because he was studying a dangerous tick-borne illness. He collected data from May 2017 to November 2019, which was serendipitously a very useful time frame. This veterinarian had monthly counts and pictures, and he published it all in a conservation and wildlife journal, which was presumably under a lot less government scrutiny than any molecular biology work related to COVID. Dr. Zhao claimed that there was a monthly average of 38 raccoon dogs and 11 palm civets in the Huanan market. The WHO team tested meat. It says so right in the report. They tested unsold contents of refrigerators and freezers, stray animals, and the contents of a fish tank. This is the extent of the animal testing that China claims to have performed at the Huanan market. The alive mammals tested were a stray dog and a stray cat. The animals tested, dead or alive, did not include palm civets or raccoon dogs, the obvious number 1 and number 2 suspects. Edie Holmes, Australian virologist, middle author on the Proximal Origin paper, had photos from the Huanan market that he claims he took in 2014. He produced a photo of a raccoon dog and a photo from inside the market. Why did he have these pictures? He studies cross-species transmissions. He has colleagues in China. He was visiting and taken to that market to witness an example of an environment where something terrible like this might happen, and he took pictures of the raccoon dogs in stall 29. So now there's these two unrelated streams of evidence that there were susceptible live mammals present. The WHO report goes on to list the absolutely mind-boggling amount of testing performed on captive wildlife post-outbreak in a theoretical attempt to find an intermediate host. They tested over 30,000 samples. Horses, elephants, baboons, guinea pigs, tigers, wolves, owls, toads, gibbons, macaws, iguanas, and on and on and on. I'm not sure who thought this was going to be helpful. This is an insane amount of work to never test one raccoon dog, which is on the list of species in general wildlife surveillance prior to the outbreak, just not on the list of species tested after the outbreak. The report also included information on environmental sampling and results. This is a map of the Huanan market. It's from the report. There's an east side and a west side separated by a road. The color coding and patterning is trying to show a lot of information at once. Each box is a vendor stall. Blue is for they took an environmental sample there, but it was negative. Beige is for they took an environmental sample there and it was positive. Red dot is where a sick person worked, with the bigger red dots being 2 or even 3 sick people worked in that stall. The blue cross-hatching is where wildlife was sold. So here. So first of all, there's like 30 sick people who worked at this market. Most of the stalls selling wildlife are here. There is one stall selling wildlife with SARS-CoV-2 positive hits. It is stall 29. It is the same location where Edie Holmes claims to have photographed raccoon dogs in 2014. The report states that 923 environmental samples were taken, most at the Huanan market and its drainage systems, with some additional sampling at other markets and nearby warehouses. The first wave of sampling occurred right after the market was shut down on January 1st. The focus was on sampling the stalls of the vendors who were sick. 11 days passed. A second wave of sampling was performed. That second wave started on January 12th and focused on the wildlife section of the market, purportedly to find an intermediate host and determine the origin of the virus. In total, 73 of the 923 samples were reported positive. The vast majority were found within the Huanan market or its drainage system. A handful of other positives were found in surrounding warehouses and sewers, and one at another market in Wuhan, though no additional detail was given. That's the only information available for about a year. Then a preprint authored by George Gao was posted online in February of 2022. It's called Surveillance of SARS-CoV-2 in the Environment and Animal Samples of the Huanan Seafood Market. Much more description of the positive samples was provided. There were 27 positive samples of about 500 from round 1, sick people stall sampling. Immediately striking is the number of positive samples on the ground, which is nearly half. And I don't know what to make of that. Maybe every particle you breathe out has to settle somewhere, and so there's more pathogens on the ground than we appreciate. Or maybe animals were slaughtered at this market. The virus in their blood was potentially just spread all around as the market was hosed off each evening. Here's the second round of sampling from January 12th. There's 5 positive samples from one location, stall 29, plus 1 positive on the inside of a freezer. From late January to late February, they seem to do a lot of sampling of drains and sewers and got a lot of positives there, though I don't really know about the utility of sampling and testing so late. The drainage in front of stall 29 was positive. Most of the other interior drainage was negative. Then a lot of drains on the periphery were positive, which makes sense because they say the wastewater from the overground drainage in the market flows to the bigger wells at the edge of the market. Just for clarity, this figure shows the same data, it's just much easier to visualize. Stalls are color-coded by the number of positive samples, and this is stall 29. Despite the number of positive samples in the raccoon dog space, the Chinese CDC's paper, original version, argued the virus in the market was probably just from sick people. These are read counts in next-gen sequencing data. SARS-CoV-2 sequence counts correlate with human DNA, so they claim. This is cheating. A bunch of data with no correlation will look extremely statistically significant if there are a handful or even just one point that is especially high or low in both. So this graph is not especially convincing to me, but also the underlying question is wrong. Does the viral sequence from the environmental samples come from animals or people? This question becomes like the linchpin of the lab leak versus natural spillover argument. But that is a silly way of thinking about it because the raccoon dog that started it all, or weasel or palm civet or whatever, would have been long gone by the time this testing was conducted. The first person to get COVID, their infection was long gone by the time this testing was conducted. Patient 0 probably didn't have to be hospitalized. We're not catching the index case. By early January, there were 30 sick people who worked at the market and several hundred to a few thousand sick people in Wuhan. No one can argue that the SARS-CoV-2 reads shouldn't correlate with human DNA at the market. There's clearly lots of sick people there putting human DNA and COVID RNA on stuff. It is much too late to put stock in the correlation between host species and virus reads. The type of sequencing I'm referencing here called next-generation sequencing. I don't know what happens when next-gen sequencing turns 25 years old, but for now it's still called next-gen sequencing or NGS. Instead of older methods that produce one long read that's like 600 to 800 base pairs-ish, NGS generates tens of thousands of very short reads that are then stitched together by deducing proportions of overlap. One SARS-CoV-2 sequence in the database will have tens or hundreds of thousands of reads and associated raw files called chromatograms, these light emission files. And next-gen sequencing also has the advantage of sequencing all the DNA that is in the tube, not just the predetermined target that you think you're interested in. There will be reads from bacteria. There will usually be a few reads from humans because a human prepared the reaction and we're always shedding skin cells. And NGS is somewhat quantitative because of that read count. The more target in the tube, the more reads of that sequence. The downside is that the analysis is complex. The program will essentially Google the reads against databases and assign some information about what animal, plant, or microbe that sequence probably belongs to. But then they have to be filtered for the sequences of interest and stitched together to come up with the COVID sequence, for example. While the preprint from the Chinese CDC on the environmental samples was published online in February of 2022, those raw sequencing files from these very important samples were not made available to the public. But in June of that year, a French researcher named Dr. Florence Debar noticed that some of the environmental sample raw data showed up in GISAID, like this database for this type of data. And holy guacamole, these were the environmental samples. What probably happened is that the Chinese CDC scientists uploaded them to the database when the preprint went online, but set an embargo date on making them public, which is common. And then they accidentally let it expire. Almost surely that's what happened. So naturally, Florence DeBar downloaded the entire data set immediately. She showed her colleagues, and they found raccoon dog DNA sequence in the samples taken from stall 29. They also found DNA of hedgehog, Malayan porcupine, bamboo rat, marmot, palm civets, weasel, and badger in the stalls in the surrounding area in the wildlife section. These sequences prove that the same animals that started SARS in 2003 were present at the Huanan market in 2019. The drama that followed was messy. Florence DeBar and her colleagues must comply with GIS-aid terms of use. Because no publication had been finalized by the actual data owners, they can't just publish their own analysis of somebody else's data. That's unethical and against the terms of use. So to comply, they must at least, in good faith, reach out to the Chinese CDC and show every effort to collaborate. The Chinese CDC yanked the data off the server the same day. Florence DeBar shared the finding with the WHO. But the story was leaked to journalists who, according to her, preyed on her team, told them lies, extracted quotes, and twisted the point into this headline, linking pandemic origin to the market. The point was really supposed to be absolute confirmation that these troublesome animals, raccoon dogs and palm civets, were present at the market. It was not supposed to be absolute confirmation of a market origin. But there's one sample that had both raccoon dog DNA and SARS-CoV-2 RNA, and that kind of became the point of the New York Times publication, which was actually published before there was even a paper about this finding because of this leak. Well, now that the story is out there, and because the team can't publish a paper using someone else's data, a scientific paper-like document was written and uploaded to Zenodo. Based on all the he said, she said debriefing interviews, every scientist involved, except those at the Chinese CDC, was supposedly in alignment that by January, there's lots of sick people at the market, so correlation of SARS-CoV-2 reads with any other species is not terribly useful for telling you what happened mid-November. Scientists are trained not to overstate conclusions. Journalists are heavily incentivized to overstate conclusions. Dr. Jesse Bloom from the Fred Hutch wrote a rebuttal paper showing that SARS-CoV-2 read count best correlates with fish DNA, and it's just unlikely to indicate whether any animals were actually infected by SARS-CoV-2. The whole affair was then kind of spun as this failure. By being too eager, the New York Times tarnished this otherwise intriguing line of evidence that COVID came from the Huanan market, and even the original journalist is bummed. Mixed into this mess, somebody had a thought that makes things a little clearer, something that in retrospect seems obvious. This is Dr. Zach Hensel, who has a lab in Portugal, but this is just on Twitter. He says combining the results of sampling fresh samples from January 1st and 11 days later sampling is deeply flawed. The degradation that would happen over those 11 days would be expected to be profound, so we cannot compare read counts between those two sets of data. He claims that if you separate the data sets, one correlates with human DNA, one correlates with wildlife DNA, but I don't really know how much statistical analysis you can do here. There's only a couple positive samples. So the bottom line is there's only one wildlife stall with virus. There's no sick person there that we know of. There were raccoon dogs there. There were palm civets next door. For some reason, China insisted on denying the presence of these animals at the Huanan market until they were faced with absolute proof. That's what we can say. Here's an outstanding question. Why cover up a market origin? I think from the American lens, a zoonosis market origin is more unavoidable, it's more faultless, it's natural. By contrast, a lab leak is an evil accident. We funded it. Torch Fauci, the psychopathic, out-of-touch scientists and their dystopian gain-of-function experiments destroyed the world. From the Chinese perspective, I think both of these are unacceptable. Lab leak, obviously, But consider who was really at fault with the market origin. The wildlife trade and these types of markets have garnered international criticism for a long time. The wildlife trade in China is a $70 billion industry. A lot of it is illegal. There are serious ethical issues with hunting and trafficking endangered species and with animal welfare in general. Add to that international pressure to reduce risk of infectious disease spillover, because this is where it happens. Imagine immediately owning up to making the same mistake twice in less than 20 years. I don't think they can do that. There's one more story I think it's important, the story of early COVID sequencing and timing the index case. In late 2021, Dr. Jesse Bloom picked a big fight with Dr. Fauci. Dr. Bloom being the first author of the letter to Science calling for investigation into COVID origin. Jesse was reading a paper that referenced some sequences he was unfamiliar with. They were supposedly from early in the pandemic and caught his attention because, as a virologist, he's so deeply familiar with all sequences available from that time that this was news. The sequences were only referenced, only included in an analysis. The paper he was reading was not the paper that generated them to begin with. All of the sequences were associated with one bioproject, but he went to the NIH's Sequence Read archive and found the accession numbers in this bioproject had been removed. A little more sleuthing, and he found that the sequences were associated with a preprint that says they were deposited in the Sequence Read archive. The paper is entitled Nanopore Targeted Sequencing for Accurate and Comprehensive Detection of SARS-CoV-2 and Other Respiratory Viruses. The paper itself is about a COVID diagnostic that can actually sequence at the same time that it diagnoses whether or not you have COVID. These sequences were supposedly from its first uses and from January of 2020. The final version of the paper was published in the journal Small without reference to the raw data, which is perplexing. The Sequence Read archive is supposed to be a permanent repository for those raw data reads. Once you deposit your data, you can't take it down or change it without specifically emailing the NIH with a special request. But Jesse Bloom found that he could recover the deleted sequences from Google Cloud by manually typing in the address and accession numbers. Okay, so now Dr. Jesse Bloom is mad that Fauci let scientists from Wuhan delete data from early in the pandemic. He also believes, based on his analyses, that the sequences from the very first sick people associated with the Huanan market are not fully representative of the viruses in circulation at the time, i.e., he thinks that maybe it didn't start at the Huanan market. Here's the observation. The samples from the very first patients have too many mutations. A virus jumps from animals into humans, starts to transmit between people. As time goes on, it should acquire mutations. What Jesse Bloom finds is that by graphing the number of mutations by date, there are later sequences that have fewer mutations relative to the ancestor than the Huanan market patients. This is like if you did a DNA test and found you were more closely related to your grandmother than your parent. How did the later patients go backwards in mutation time? Here's a picture to illustrate the concept. Rat G13, closest bat relative, inferred progenitor of SARS-CoV-2 based on all available sequences at this point in time. You basically have two groups. A group that is two purple mutations away from the inferred progenitor and is acquiring mutations over time, and a group that has no mutations from the inferred progenitor and is acquiring mutations over time. The Huanan market patients are all the purple type, but they were sampled first. The tricky thing here is that to come up with this pattern, you need a virus to acquire two mutations, seed all the sick people at the market, then revert backwards towards the ancestor by exactly those same two mutations, then seed another line. Hopefully this visual shows you how unlikely that intuitively feels. It's a relatively slowly evolving virus with one mutation per week or two in a genome of 29,000 base pairs. It's going to get two mutations, then revert those same two mutations back to exactly what they were without getting any new mutations. Something's not right. And not just Jesse, but several scientists are twisting themselves into a pretzel trying to figure out a lineage tree that explains this cleanly. Jesse Bloom writes up this observation in a paper and insinuates that there's some kind of ascertainment bias at the market, or that there was considerable spread through the community before the virus got to the market. Basically, he's saying that this too many mutation conundrum supports a non-Huanan market origin. Now, notably, there's kind of a leap of logic. The new samples, the recovered deleted sequences, do not really explain the dilemma. The heart of this paper is really about his irritation that the NIH let sequences from the database be deleted, and he combined that with the too many mutation observation. But the reasoning linking the two is weak, in my opinion, though some of the insights are neutral and helpful. Like, he figured out that some of the sequences were taken in one place at one time, but then sequenced in another place at another time, and by getting to the bottom of that, things do fit a little bit better. But the observation still stands, and the recovered sequences aren't the key. The paper is called Recovery of Deleted Deep Sequencing Data Sheds More Light on Early Wuhan SARS-CoV-2 Epidemic. He sent a copy to the NIH before the preprint went live online. A video call with Dr. Fauci was scheduled for the following day for what was clearly going to be a "we duel at dawn" type of interaction. Dr. Bloom was permitted to bring backup. He brought Sergey Pond from Temple University and Rasmus Nielsen from Berkeley. Fauci and Collins brought Bob Gary and Christian Andersen, the first and last author of Proximal Origin. The story of this exchange was covered by Vanity Fair. Apparently, the meeting devolved into a fight immediately. Particularly central was Christian Andersen. He and Rasmus Nielsen disagreed strongly about whether the pattern they were seeing in the sequence data from the earliest cases was perfectly normal or highly unusual. Christian also didn't think it was ethical to analyze someone else's deleted data. But I don't really think ethics and tree rooting gets people so heated. Christian's third issue was about security, and I think that's probably the core of the problem. He was receiving death threats and paying for private security. Jesse Bloom's paper was only going to fan the flames of conspiracy theorists, and he was mad. This is not an isolated problem. Angela Rasmussen has been pretty open on her Twitter about the death threats. She's a former member of the Drastic research team who turned Natural Origin. Michael Warabi has spoken about the threats he's received both from lab leak conspiracy theorists and the Chinese Communist Party. Ralph Barrick's lab on campus was under some extra security measures for a while because they had at least one angry person actually physically show up in search of confrontation, thinking that this lab had started the pandemic. While it doesn't excuse the scientists' behavior, I think it's important to remember that people are multifaceted. The court of public opinion tends to take evidence of attempted concealment like absolute confirmation that the dissenting silenced narrative is true, when there are in fact several credible motivations for attempting to silence something that have nothing to do with whether it's actually true or false. I think it's totally conceivable to 100% believe that virus came from the Huanan market while being incapable of being calm, cool, and collected because you're paying exorbitant amounts of money for private security to protect your family. That is understandable to me. There are discrepancies between the preprint and the final paper where Jesse Bloom apparently was convinced he was incorrect, and he revised or deleted those parts that I did not mention here. Dr. Fauci is reported to have been rather quiet through this tense discussion. The only thing he had a problem with was Jesse's use of the word surreptitiously, as in the sequences were deleted surreptitiously. He said, "We cannot know the Chinese author's intent." At the end of this interaction, Christian Andersen said, "Hey, I'm in with that preprint server. I can make this go away." Which of course was met with the response, "I don't think that would be appropriate given the contentious nature of this meeting." Everyone seemed to understand that a line had been crossed. Collins told Andersen best not to pressure him to delete or revise the preprint. He's already submitted it. Fauci made sure that everyone on the call understood that he did not advise deleting or revising the preprint. When asked later what happened, Bob Gary denies this was ever suggested. Sergey Pond says that's about exactly how he remembers it. This is a rough look for Christian Andersen. But Dr. Fauci did give Jesse Bloom the email so that he could publish it in his paper. Figure 6, the reasons for requesting the data be deleted. The reasons are kind of meh. Maybe believable, but on the surface seem to make little sense. The timing correlated with the Chinese government crackdown on molecular biology publication censorship, and Jesse Bloom believed this was hard proof of Chinese authors obfuscating data. After cooling off a little bit, Bob Gary and Christian Anderson went on TWIV, This Week in Virology podcast. It's a lot to ask of a defensive person to just stick to their two strongest talking points. It's unfortunate, but these two men come across like they have been awake all night, polishing their arguments like little goblins polishing precious stones. There are some good points, there are some petty points, there are some technically bad points, and the podcast is dripping with disdain for Dr. Bloom. Here's my summary. Get with the program, Dr. Bloom. China is not being transparent or forthcoming. This is not news. Being antagonistic is not helpful, and it's bad form to attack individual researchers who are clearly at the mercy of their government. The sequences were published in a major journal, just no raw data. The sequences in the text of the paper match the deleted raw data. There's no funny business. The sequences are from January, not nearly as interesting or impactful as if finding sequences from December. All of these arguments are fair. I'll skip the weaker and pettier points. Here's my take on Jesse Bloom's paper. Consciously or unconsciously, he employs a common logistic strategy we probably all do when constructing a written argument, which is to lay out a series of possibilities but save the favorite for last, kind of meander around before releasing the big guns. It could be scenario 1, but that doesn't make sense because of X. An alternative explanation is scenario 2, but that one has problems too, so I don't know. Could be scenario 3, but shoot, doesn't quite fit. Scenario 4, gotcha. That one makes the most sense because it explains everything perfectly. Here's the problem. His scenario 3 is, my archenemy proposed a theory that my observations totally support, but I just don't believe it. The theory is that there were two separate zoonosis events, i.e. two jumps from animal to person. He credits Bob Gary for originally proposing the multiple market hypothesis, and Jesse Bloom dismisses the multiple market hypothesis as non-parsimonious, or likely to not be right because it's not a simple explanation. Without really any justification, he just states that he doesn't think it's plausible that there could be two jumps at two markets. Note, it is a logical flaw made by both Bob Gary and Jesse Bloom that the two jumps have to come from two separate markets. There can, of course, be two jumps, one market. One pool of infected animals at the Huanan market ultimately infect two people who work at that market. So in a way, Jesse is right that this happened twice in two markets doesn't seem like the simplest solution. But let us remember, this exact scenario happened before. There were multiple jumps at multiple markets seeding the original SARS outbreaks in 2002 and 2003. Because the animals seemed to pick up infections in the logistics and transport, then disperse to multiple markets across the city and sustain the infections as fresh, naive animals are brought in. SARS-CoV-2 seemed to be squashed a lot faster, though. They knew what to do. No matter what kind of less information is better motto they have going on, they shut down that market immediately. Maybe that tells you everything you need to know. The 2002 Senate Committee's interim report used this specific issue as a critique to the natural origin zoonosis hypothesis. They complain that the epidemiology looks different than SARS because SARS had multiple spillovers at multiple markets. SARS-CoV-2 looks different, just one lineage. Why would that be? Dun dun dun. Well, be careful what you wish for. We now know that there were two lineages introducing COVID to humans. One transmission is what we call lineage B. That's the first human-to-human transmission train. A week or so later, there was another transmission kicking off a separate line of infection we call lineage A. Lineage B was more successful. It infected more people. Lineage A either didn't replicate well or didn't have as many contact opportunities, and it eventually died out. The 12 sequenced early cases of sick people from the Huanan market have lineage B because lineage B dwarfed lineage A from the start. The likelihood of sampling lineage B anywhere was just far higher. A dual introduction hypothesis fits this observation a lot better than a hypothesis like Jesse Bloom proposed, where there's just a lot more genetic diversity in the early days than China let on. Because there's not a lot of diversity. There's just two clear lineages without much other evolution yet. Computer modeling confirms the intuitive conclusion. We can take existing sequence data from a point in time, and a computer algorithm can try out thousands of scenarios and generate probabilities of specific events. Using 787 full COVID genome sequences deposited in databases by February 14th, Pekar et al. Simulated the early pandemic under various constraints. That lineage A is the ancestral lineage, that lineage B is the ancestral lineage, an unconstrained ancestral lineage, making the doubling time longer or shorter, making the percent of ascertained infections higher or lower. And by simulating how can we get to this body of sequences by February, the computer finds that there's a 99.5% chance that COVID's the result of two independent jumps. The highest probability infection date of lineage B index case is November 18th, and it's November 29th for lineage A, plus or minus a week for both estimates. Among certain circles, there's considerable speculation that COVID began before China admits. There were, in retrospect, a handful of people hospitalized prior to the first Huanan market delivery man who are suspected to have COVID. The joint China WHO report states that there was no evidence of antibodies in blood donors through December 2019. But what are you going to do? That type of data would be very easy to falsify. You just write negative. A point that gets talked about a lot on podcasts and conservative media is hospital parking lot data. This is statistical analysis of satellite images of parking lots. These are the parking lot pictures. Busy in September, busy in December, and in February, kind of empty. Late January, early February is the absolute height of COVID chaos based on all the other information we have, like the Weibo app, I'm sick, help me button. But the city is locked down by this point, so there's less cars. The paper shows this graph of the data from all hospitals included in the analysis and applies this smoothing line and shows this increase prior to November. Then it's followed by a crash downward. To justify the utility of this parking lot satellite imaging technique, they cite a paper. It's been used one time before, and in that paper, parking lot fullness ranged from 0% full to over 100% full if they can see people parking on side streets and stuff. So I would just be cautious about interpreting what appears to be maybe like a 25% increase. The paper also shows this graph showing increase in internet searches for the word diarrhea, which is a word associated with COVID, but not flu. And you see this start in August. But what I think goes against their point a little bit is that there is no corresponding increase in search of the word cough. Then when flu starts, there's an increase in the search for the word cough, but no corresponding increase for diarrhea. Then, in December and January, skyrocketing search for both. So I don't think either of these is COVID related. In the clear COVID era, people search for both. There's one theory that the Military World Games was a super spreading event, and articles on this subject reference the strong correlation between countries that sent a lot of athletes to the games and countries that had large numbers of COVID cases. This is the graph that they're referring to, number of athletes attending the military games versus number of cases in the country. I don't know if this looks compelling to you. It doesn't look particularly compelling to me. But you realize the time frame is a year. From October 2019 to October 2020. And it's not cases per 100,000 people. It's total cases. So something like the number of people living in a country might simultaneously influence the number of people they sent to the military games and the number of cases of COVID in their country in a year. Or another thought, developed countries might send a lot of athletes to the military games, and developed countries might also have robust COVID testing and case reporting in the first year. This is among the absolute bottom of the barrel in making any attempt to disentangle correlation from causation. Please see yourself out Sole author, Miss Amy Elise Winter of no affiliated university. The fact that this data is clinged to and parroted over and over again is illustrative of the horrifying magnitude of cherry picking that we have going on in the media. Given the existing diversity, the number of mutations within the 780 available sequences from this moment in time in February of 2020, 99% of simulations find that there are under 33 infections by December 1st. Earlier cases are not actually inconsistent with natural origin. Lineage A and Lineage B started in late October or November. That's fairly certain. But by modeling transmission and the likelihood of a virus to go on or die out, an estimated 5 jumps total was necessary to get a true foothold and take off. An unrecognized slow burn in Wuhan is totally possible. It just has to be that those lineage popped up and then went extinct. But I think that the parking lot and internet search paper kind of shoots itself in the foot a little bit. I look at this graph and I think people got sick in December and January. Index case seeding in Europe and the Americas can be back calculated in a similar way. You can see what lineages are seeded, what went extinct, and what continued on to be the main strains affecting those areas. I think our ability to look at all the sequence data that any Joe Schmo scientist decides to dump into any database and then back calculate these events so clearly presents a powerful challenge to the idea that COVID was circulating widely before, any earlier than we recognized. In Seattle, they were able to use samples from a flu study to go retest for COVID to see exactly when appreciable community spread began, and it matches up with these back-calculated seeding predictions. Not until February. Sequence data is not easily falsifiable. First of all, researchers put raw reads into the online databases, meaning you would have to physically construct a piece of nucleic acid and analyze it to create that raw file. It's one thing to do that for one strain, it's another to do that for 700 and somehow prohibit all other individuals on Earth from uploading their real data that would mess with your pattern. This operation would be mind-bogglingly complex and burdensome, and further, someday someone will do an analysis and something will stick out like a sore thumb. The falsified sequence will have too many mutations, or too few, or it'll be getting mutations in a usually conserved area, and there will be someone brave enough to call it out, probably Dr. Jesse Bloom. Every environmental sample from the market was Lineage B, except for one. There was one Lineage A environmental sample taken from a discarded glove in the wildlife section of the market. And the sequences of the environmental samples, not the raw data, but the mutations compared to consensus, were published by the Chinese CDC before the definitive conclusion that there were 2 separate jumps. While scientists were still twisting into a pretzel trying to figure out how to make a tree with one introduction, the Chinese CDC reported that there were, both Lineage A and Lineage B were in the market before they had the Lineage A and Lineage B names. They were just reporting the mutations before we understood the significance of Lineage A and B. I just don't think that that's anticipatable. I don't think that's mastermindable, no matter how organized and educated and authoritarian. Let's juxtapose that level of sophistication to a real-life example of cover-up. Same time periods, same authorities making decisions. An untrue assertion is put forward. There were no live animals in the market. And then over the course of the next 2 years, 3 completely independent lines of evidence totally disprove it. I think that something that has happened before is more likely than something that has not happened before. Li Wenliang's viral WeChat message said, "We have 7 cases in our hospital from the Huanan market. All of these people's timelines align, even Zheng Lixi's. There is so much concurrent and believable chaos all descending on Wuhan in late December. There were 2 introductions. How do you have 2 lab leaks a week apart that differ by 2 mutations? And both Lineage A and Lineage B were in the market. There's a lot of positive samples in the raccoon dog space. Raccoon dogs and palm civets were present in the market, and the Chinese government was of absolutely no help confirming that other than what they did accidentally." We're juxtaposing this next to there were no positive animals at the market. Well, it's hard to find a positive animal if you don't test any. Genetic engineering concerns. Invalidated. Incredibly similar sequences exist in bats from Laos to Japan. The furin cleavage site was definitely not engineered. The WIV database was taken down. Okay, but it went back up in December and January and didn't come down again until lab leak rumors took hold in February. Zhang Lishi had this strong alibi in publishing 630 sequences just a few months prior to the start of the pandemic, narrowing the possibility of lab leak because now all of these unlikely events have to stack, and the one that escapes her lab has to be something separate and special from her normal work. There's a claim from an unidentified person in government that Zhang Lishi's lab workers got sick in November. I understand that that's weird, but there is so much stuff that is put forth as fact, and it turns out to be hogwash with just the slightest look under the hood. I don't have an x-ray that shows ground glass opacities and says Benjamin Hu, November 2019. One of my takeaways is that even in an environment of authoritarian censorship and retaliation, it seems really hard to keep a secret. We can't think of China as just one conglomerate of organized execution with one unified goal. China is made of people who have their own motivations, some of whom are defiant. When you are convinced everything is rigged and you despair of the world, you forget that it's really hard to control people who are willing to suffer any consequence to do what they believe is right. There was redundancy in the good actors. Multiple early doctors noticed the cases. 3 separate individuals raised the alarm in a 3-day window. 8 people were arrested and reprimanded for spreading rumors. We have solid examples of scientists who are not controlled by fear and funding money who would absolutely call out that they believe COVID came from the lab. It's just that most scientists think that those few are wrong.